We are recording this on Monday afternoon, and as we speak, in fact, Donald Trump is meeting Keir Starmer up in Scotland, and we wanted to take this opportunity to talk about that and to talk about the meetings that have happened over the weekend and this strange sense of Donald Trump, the sort of Caesar emperor, visiting his vassal state over here and holding court up at his own private residence in Scotland. He has a number of golf courses, and that is where everybody's kind of Mar-a-Lago in Scotland, it seems like. And you had this extraordinary sight of Ursula von der Leyen traveling to Brexit Britain to visit Donald Trump and to agree a trade deal which has infuriated many across Europe at how lopsided it appears to be and how much the Europeans appeared to have caved to his demands. So, Megan, you are Canadian originally. So I think you come with an interesting perspective because you can sort of talk us through the different tactics that the different leaders, global leaders, have used against Trump, from the kind of Carney approach, which is much more aggressive, to the Starmer approach at the other end of the perspective, which has obviously been much more kind of fawning and has achieved, on the face of it, a better trade deal than the one that the European Union have got. So, Megan, do you want to tell us from a sort of diplomatic perspective the different strategies that are at play here?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I think it's important to note that the von der Leyen agreement on Sunday was initially touted by her, but also in the immediate press reports as, a victory. Mm-hmm. So Trump has been threatening 30% tariffs on the EU, which would be ruinous for the EU. And reporting from yesterday said that during the course of their talk, it was quite intense and that Trump was still insisting on 30%, and then he went down to 21% before they finally agreed at 15%. Mm-hmm. So the initial kind of news lines coming out of that agreement was, this is a victory, von der Leyen did a great thing, it was amazing. Then the European responses started to trickle out. So, we had Giorgia Meloni and Chancellor Merkel, welcoming the deal, saying that's great. But then France.
Right, yes.
France started to get involved. The Prime Minister said that the deal marks a dark day for the EU. Macron has not said anything at all, which is in itself significant. Yes. The French trade minister said that Trump only understands force and that the EU would have been better to respond by showing their capacity to retaliate. Now, this is very indicative of the Canadian approach. Yep. So under Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau before that, actually, there's been a very, very firm, we will retaliate, we will match tariffs for tariffs, we are going to hit this strong, and very much the idea that Trump does only respond to strength. Mm-hmm. And, the Canadian public has responded very well to that. It's domestically been a very, very strong thing. There's a lot of bipartisan support in Canada for that strategy. You don't really see anyone saying, oh, no, we should, be buddying up with Trump at this moment. Mm-hmm. Canada very much sees it as an existential threat. Now, Starmer, obviously, as you mentioned, has taken the complete opposite approach. And actually, I don't think, and maybe you will know differently, but I can't really think of anyone in the UK who is suggesting that Starmer take any other approach than what he's taking.
No, I think it's really interesting. I mean, there have been voices among the kind of pro-European left who have made the point that we might think of ourselves as, or be quite sort of happy that we have got away, as they would see it, with a sort of 10% basic tariff rate. And aren't we clever that we've got ahead of the Europeans? We negotiated first, we got 10%, they got 15%. So Starmer's tactics have proved correct. And they would make the wider point that, well, all we are doing is kind of dividing up the opposition to Trump and what is a fundamentally illegitimate, as they would say, sort of strategy from Trump, like bully boy tactics, to divide and rule not just the West, but sort of the world in its response. But if we think of it, particularly the West, Canada the EU and the UK, the main pillars of the transatlantic alliance alongside the US. And Trump has managed to divide them into three different strategies. And he appears to be winning by dividing. And we would have been much better, even if we got punished in the first place, by aligning and having a joint approach with the Canadians and the Europeans. And I think it does probably say something about Britain. The very fact, as you've put it, that there's almost no opposition to Starmer's strategy here. Starmer's strategy has been to cozy up, to act in a kind of singular British interest, and to emerge and to take credit. Now, that obviously puts the Labour Party in a difficult position. Now, mostly they are pro-European Remainers who are now having to defend a deal that divided the Europeans' response and led to Britain getting a different deal to the one the Europeans are getting. So I think what you're seeing now, I mean, I find it interesting because even in Europe, you've got this divided response. I mean, maybe that is the kind of lesson here, that there is no collective West, and there isn't even a collective EU response to this because the French are absolutely furious. So I wonder whether there is going to be a fresh move within Europe towards strengthening the EU to be able to operate more kind of forcefully in situations like this.
I think definitely that there could be that movement. I think one of the things that people will be looking out for is to see how these various strategies kind of play out over, the rest of Trump's term. You just mentioned Trump having a victory. Well, just speaking for Will Dunn, our business editor, and saying what I think he would say, we have not yet seen how these tariffs are going to impact the American economy and whether there's going to be a lot of pushback there domestically, and whether that will, kind of shape Trump's response going forward to these deals.
Yeah, I suppose it's like a victory in which no one wins. No. There's just like degrees of losing in which he loses the least, perhaps, or certainly against the Europeans. Or I think it's more that in his mind, he is winning by imposing higher tariffs on imports into the United States than used to be the case, and not having reciprocal levels of tariffs because America is stronger. That's the deal with Britain. That's the deal with the EU. Talk us through why Canada has been able to hold the line against this strategy. Because from a purely business perspective, you would say that Canada is losing as well, that it has both higher import and export costs now.
Definitely. And that's the thing. That's why we still need to see how this plays out, because at the moment, the Canadian public is on board with this strategy. Yeah. As the economy continues to take hit after hit and suffer the consequences of, even if it's not a dramatic sharp hit or a drop, just the erosion, I guess, of these tariffs and what that does to Canadian businesses who rely on exports to the US, or Canadian business who rely on imports, what that does to them over time. There could be kind of a sea change where people realize maybe this wasn't the strategy. Maybe we do need Trump too much, and they kind of forget about those threats about Canada becoming the 51st state, or Trump kind of says, "Oh, that was only a joke. I never really meant it," and people forget that anger over their actual, fear of what the economy is shaping out to be.
How is the economy doing?
Not great.
Not as a result of this.
It hasn't been, I think, as dramatic as a lot of people feared. But the economy already wasn't in the best place. It had the same issues that every other Western country has been facing the last few years: cost of living crisis, housing shortages, inflation, and there has been a significant kind of downgrade since this all started.
I do think it's interesting, and I'd love your perspective on it. How we have a situation where you could say, theoretically at least, that of the three different, I was going to say countries, but the EU is not a country, but of the three different kind of states that are responding to Trump, Canada has the most to lose and is the weakest in terms of, the size of the economy. Then you have the UK, and then you have the EU. Canada is taking the most aggressive stance, even though it's the weakest of the three. Britain is taking the softest stance, but that is traditional. And the EU is trying to negotiate some middle ground here. But is there a kind of different weakness here that underlies this, which is that the European Union might be the biggest, but it is currently facing the most profound challenge to its security on the eastern flank. And that really explains what's going on here, in that there is, the Canadians came together because they felt an actual threat to Canadian sovereignty. And that sort of explains the resolve that they have taken. Britain has no kind of direct threat to its sovereignty at the moment and feels in a position to take the sort of softest way forward. And the Europeans feel a threat, and they are currently dependent on American defense. Mm-hmm. And so really, even though they're the strongest and they should be able to stand up to the Americans, they have concluded that they're not able to do so.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a matter of what each country or body looks at as the most existential threat of the moment. So Canadians, it was to their sovereignty. Trump was actively threatening to take over the country, basically, annex the country. Yeah. The EU sees Russia and the prospect of war in the country as its most existential threat. So it weighs up the balance there and decides it's better to have Trump on board with security than it is to maybe really go head to head on this battle over trade. Mm-hmm. For the UK, I mean, you probably will have more insight into this than I will. I imagine maybe that for Starmer's government, the threat is, in a way, the economy needs to improve if his government wants to survive or get another term. And they are just so battled on every front in that case. So really, they kind of need to do everything they can on all sides. And a trade war with Trump right now just doesn't seem feasible for them, but you might have different insights into this.
That's exactly right. Like, we don't have very many weapons to have a war with anybody, exactly. On economics. And I think the fundamental reason why the UK has had a, in quotes, better deal than the EU is because we don't have a trade surplus with the United States in the way that the EU does. So they're always going to be in a difficult position. I think from a sort of thinking about the sort of British instinct and the European instinct here, for me, these are kind of interesting psychological moments, which I don't think were clear yet how they will kind of play through. Because if there is a sense of humiliation on the EU's part, I think it will have an effect on European politics. But I think that is yet to be processed here in the UK as well. Because we feel somehow that we've got away with it, that we're benefiting from our own weakness. But it is fundamentally from a position of profound weakness here. And we are still sending our Prime Minister up to kind of beg for scraps at the table of this visiting emperor in Scotland. And I've always wondered, I mean, I've plug here, I've got a book coming out in September about Britain's long history of Euroscepticism since the war. And I think if you go and look at these sort of foundational figures in Europe and the UK and the US, when we're building what was seen as the kind of the free world or the transatlantic world, they were figures like Jean Monnet in France and some of the great diplomats in post-war US history, Kenyon and others. And also in the UK, figures like obviously Churchill and Macmillan. And they had this grand vision of what either the Atlantic world looked like or the European world. Jean Monnet, even though he's the founding father of European integration, was actually a British bureaucrat working in the United States, and was seen by Charles de Gaulle as far too much of an Anglophile to be trusted, not French enough in any sense. And they were building this transatlantic world in which Europe was a kind of core pillar and a united Europe that could stand against Russia. Now, I think what Trump does is kind of starts to shatter that sense of kind of a collective identity. And it's almost as if the reality of that world starts to be revealed in its kind of just the raw American power, that these are not pillars of a transatlantic world. There is one central pillar in which we kind of shelter, and that is the Canadians, the Brits, and the Europeans. And the level of kind of humiliation that each of those sort of sheltering bits of this alliance is going through, whether it's the Canadians being battered and taking a certain direction, or Britain, even though they've got this sort of trade deal that is being held up as successful, or the Europeans, I think it will start to have this impact on the psyche. And I think you mentioned the French at the beginning, and I think this is absolutely fundamental. You know, the language that is being used online now by some former diplomats. Gérard Araud is worth checking out. He was a former French ambassador to the US. Is absolutely vitriolic. And it comes back to a kind of Gaullist idea of sort of dignity, I think, in a way, that is undignified to accept such a deal. And you would be better, even if you took more pain, pursuing a kind of Canadian approach. And I think that is an interesting argument that will continue to play out. And I was interested, I also saw a Danish commentator making the same case. And the Danes are some of the most Atlanticist members of the EU. And if that kind of argument is starting to drip into European discourse, can it start to sort of take on a life of its own? And the final thought I have, I'd be interested to know your perspective is, from a British perspective, I've always been slightly surprised that sort of Anglo-Gaullism or British Gaullism has never been a thing. It's never really taken off as a kind of nationalistic anti-American sentiment on the right. We have a kind of skeptical view of America from the left, clearly. But that kind of notion that is now quite obvious, that the left have always said that American power is effectively imperial, that was also shared by the right in France. Now, why isn't it sort of taking off? Why isn't that thing taking off in Britain or Europe?
I mean, it is an interesting question. And one thing, just to your point about the Danes, I mean, they are the other country that, like Canada, has also received, threats to their own territory with Greenland. So I do think that there is something that Trump taps into in a way that, I mean, it provokes a response that he probably doesn't actually want, to have people fighting back against him with such force. But he does know how to kind of cut to the quick and really get to the heart of basically pushing people over the line. The very Atlanticist Danes, the very nice Canadians, and just provoke these responses that just surprise the rest of the world. As for the question on why an Anglo-Gaullicism hasn't really manifested, I don't know. When I first moved to this country, I was quite surprised by the national psychology that the Brits have towards the French. And I recognize it in a bit of a way from what the Canadians feel about Americans. I mean, there's quite a lot of differences, but just a real, maybe hostility is too strong of a word, but in a way that, there is no anti-Americanism on the right in the UK, really. There's a lot of anti-Americanism throughout Canada across the spectrum. And it's just something that's coloured and tainted domestic politics in a way that made it quite surprising when I first moved here to kind of encounter the pro-American attitudes of Brits that I really just wasn't expecting. And I'm not too sure, having not grown up with that psychology, it did feel quite alien to me. And I'm not really sure what to make of it.
I mean, I think the answer to that question, Megan, probably lies back again with sovereignty and the sense that Americans were the ultimate protectors of British sovereignty in the Second World War. So it kind of all comes back to feelings of how to protect the most kind of existential question, I guess, in foreign policy terms. I mean, I think this is where the French attitude is really interesting. And I think there were senses in the British government, and certainly those around Starmer, who were advocating for a more, in quotes, French kind of foreign policy, or certainly a kind of more Gaullist foreign policy, which was the French had always taken the view, and they still do now as well, not just on this trade deal that von der Leyen has agreed, but also questions of how do you arm the Ukrainians most effectively? And the European response and the British response has always been, we'll just buy the American kit off the shelf and get it to the front lines as quickly as possible. And that, I think, has been the sort of the general rule that certainly Britain, but also I think the sort of more Northern European countries have followed. And you see this spectacle then of Britain agreeing to buy F-35s from the United States and then arm them with American nuclear weapons, sort of almost like acting as an imperial carrier for their weapons. And the French essentially saying no, that even if you have slightly worse equipment or more expensive equipment, or it takes longer to get, you need to build up the European industrial capacity, because in the long run, that's the only way that you can get free from the American security guarantee. And I do think that comes to a kind of fundamentally interesting foreign policy question, which is Trump really seeking to allow Europe to become free from American security? Or does he just want to sort of shake Europe down for more cash to pay for American supremacy? And I think I'm sort of leaning more towards the latter, that he doesn't really want Europe to be free and independent and able to stand up to the Americans. He just wants to get more out of them.
I've heard arguments for both sides. They're both persuasive. I'm with you, though. I'm the latter. I think Trump definitely completely transactional, wants to shake down Europe for the best kind of deal he can get. And he wants that to keep going into the future. An independent and free Europe isn't worth much to the US financially.
Yeah, and the Canadians, to take it back to Canada for a moment, because I thought there were a couple of interesting developments that I saw. One was there seemed to be a sort of genuine sense of hurt when Starmer went to the Oval Office and didn't stand up for Canadian independence. And then there was this poll that came out that saying the Canadians would like to join the EU. Now, I wonder, are either of those things like serious developments? And does a moment like this sort of shake that notion away? Like, does it sort of say, well, of course, it doesn't matter if you join the EU. You're still going to be shaken down by the American president because that's what he does.
I think the Starmer incident, I think that there was a sense of profound hurt. Canada really does see itself as, as part of the Commonwealth. That's how it conceives of itself. And I think the fact that Starmer didn't kind of intervene on its behalf was an insult, but also quite alarming. And it goes back to this existential question. If Trump were to, attempt to annex Canada, who would intervene? Who would Canada come to rely on? And I think that's why you exactly. So I think that it sent. I think there was some a profound reckoning within the country of Canada's place in the world and its relationships with its allies.
It doesn't feel British, right? It feels a connection.
It feels a connection. It doesn't feel British. But I think, depending on who you ask, I think culturally, people do feel more connected to the UK in some ways than they do to America. which I know is very baffling for Brits to hear.
Across the whole of the country.
Yes.
I was in Alberta once and it kind of felt very American, very Western.
Yes, I do get the disconnect people feel when they hear that. But I do think culturally, ancestrally, people just have a real deep connection to the UK that they kind of see as more integral to who they are as a people than they do feel that connection to the US.
What about the EU then? Did you think that was sort of ever real from the Canadian perspective? Like, could Canada plausibly join the European Union?
I mean, I really don't understand what mechanism they would use to make that work. But, for a pure, economic sense, if they could, I'm sure that would solve a lot of problems that Trump has posed now with the tariffs.
Perhaps, although they just find themselves, von der Leyen arguing on their behalf for a certain tariff. On this question of the Commonwealth, Megan, like when I was researching the book, one of the things that was really striking, I mentioned it before, this kind of lack of any kind of British Gaullism or anti-Americanism on the right. There is one figure who was that anti-American, extremely right-wing person in British politics, and that was Enoch Powell. And the interesting thing about Powell was he was this huge imperialist up until the point of Indian independence and the emergence of the Commonwealth. And then Powell became the most fiercely critical person in Parliament about the Commonwealth. And Powell's argument was the Commonwealth was a sham, that it didn't actually amount to anything. And it was just a way of Britain pretending that the empire still existed and we could have this sort of great, glorious, globe-spanning jamboree, of which obviously the Canadians also seem to have taken part and believed in. I think there is something profound about Trump's impact in that he has this, through his kind of words and actions and complete contempt for all of these structures, he kind of reveals how true they are. How true is European unity? How true is the idea of a Western alliance? How true is the Commonwealth? And it turns out on so many of these questions that when push comes to shove, most of the countries, even within the EU, start acting in their own national interests as they perceive them, rather than as some kind of collective.
That's the kind of extraordinary thing about Trump, is that by saying the unsayable and shattering kind of these illusions, these diplomatic stories that a lot of people tell themselves, that, a lot of systems kind of come to rely on upholding. But yet Trump starts to just tear down the facade of all of these ideas and reveal them to be what they are, which is, just stories at the end of the day in a lot of ways. And when one person kind of shatters that, there's, I think, a lot of panic, and everyone else kind of just scrambles around to, shore up their situation in the best way they can.
But I think what's really interesting watching Trump is then, so say he shatters these kind of illusions that we have about the meaning of the institutions that we've built since the Second World War, or how powerful they actually are, or how much we're actually just living in a kind of American imperium. If that's like his world historic role in a sense, does he also shatter his own story at the same time? Because you see, we mentioned it at the beginning that we're recording this as Donald Trump is meeting Keir Starmer in Scotland, and we're watching Trump say things like he's going to put pressure on Vladimir Putin. He's going to cut the number of days that he gave him to come to the table, I think, or to find a ceasefire. He's going to, what does he say? I'm going to make a new deadline of about 10 or 12 days from today, he tells Starmer. And then he also talks about trying to get more aid into Gaza. He is also exposing his own weakness, his own failure to make any difference in the war in Ukraine. And his and the other fundamental reality of American power, that Israel only listens to one state in the world, and that is the United States. Nobody has any more power, and so that he has to take ownership of what is going on in Gaza. And so we have this story, as you put it before, story of Trump, the peacemaker, who can just change the fundamentals of global diplomacy just through his sheer force of kind of personality. And all he does is kind of shatter the idea of the Western alliance as anything different from American power. And he reveals, in some sense, the limits of American power in Eastern Europe and its ownership of the crisis in the Middle East at the same time. Lots of things that the far left in British politics have been saying for a long time now.
I mean, yes. So this story of Trump, the peacemaker, which, he campaigned on, he really tried to present this idea of himself as, being anti-foreign wars, being, the person who is going to get a deal in 24 hours between Russia and Ukraine and just end that war. And as much as Trump loves to spin a tale, he does keep hitting into reality. Yep. Now, that's also why he doesn't like to be pinned down on things, and he's very, very want to change his story and contradict himself, and say one thing to one global actor and then turn around and say completely the opposite. He really doesn't like to be pinned down. But I think even Trump was surprised at the intractability of these conflicts.
Yep.
I think he probably has been very disappointed by Putin. I think he thought they had, if not a kinship, at least an understanding. And from what I hear, talking to a lot of people with insight into the Kremlin, Putin does have a degree of respect for Trump, or at least Trump's transactionalism. I've heard that it's actually Witkoff that Putin really just has no time for and thinks is just a
patsy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And was a bit insulted when Witkoff was sent to Moscow.
Yeah, because he just wants to deal with the premier.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this sort of Trump bumping up against the intractability of global politics and power is like a fascinating story, because it also then reveals the actual contours of world power at the moment. And it is fundamentally very telling that the two countries that they are struggling to bully into an acceptance is China economically and Russia geopolitically.